The Aral Sea was once the world's fourth largest lake, but during the Soviet period, the two rivers that feed it were diverted.
This is the Aral Sea. In 1960, it contained over 1 trillion cubic meters of water and produced more than 40,000 tons of fish every year. But by 2000, it had lost around 90% of that water, wiping out all 24 of its native commercial fish species. Scientists called it one of the fastest and worst environmental disasters in modern history. But today, something strange is happening. The Aral Sea is returning, but not in the way you might expect. A newly built 13-kilometer concrete dam has caused water levels to rise by 40 feet, far exceeding what experts originally predicted. So, how is the Aral Sea making a comeback? And why is one half experiencing a miraculous revival, while the other half is permanently dying? Let's dive in. The sea that vanished. When you look at a modern map of Central Asia, you see a few scattered patches of water along the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But what you're looking at is only a fraction of what once existed. The Aral Sea was the fourth largest inland sea on Earth. It stretched across nearly 68,000 square kilometers, larger than the entire country of Sri Lanka, and almost the exact same size as Ireland. From space, it looked like a giant blue world trapped in the middle of endless sand. And around that water, entire cities were built. In the north, the port city of Aralsk was filled with fishing boats, factories, and busy harbors. In the south, Moynak became one of the most important fishing centers in the entire Soviet Union. This was not some forgotten lake in the middle of nowhere. The Aral Sea supplied nearly 1/6 of all fish consumed across the Soviet Union. Every year, more than 40,000 tons of fish were pulled from its waters, including carp, sturgeon, and bream. Thousands of people built their lives around this sea. Then, almost unbelievably, the water began disappearing. Year after year, the shoreline kept moving farther away. In some places, the sea level dropped by nearly 1 meter every single year. Harbors became beaches. Beaches became desert. Massive fishing ships were left stranded where water once existed beneath them. Some vessels were so large that they could not even be moved. They simply stayed there, frozen in the sand like rusting skeletons from another world. But what was the reason behind this shift, and where did all the water go? Before we answer that, here is the strangest part of the whole story. The Aral Sea was never in an easy place to survive. It sat between two brutal deserts, the Karakum and Kizilkum. Summer temperatures regularly climbed above 40 degrees Celsius, and more importantly, the sea had no outlet to any ocean. That means water could flow into it, but the only way it could leave was through evaporation. Under that desert heat, enormous amounts of water vanished into the air every single year. By all logic, this sea should have dried up thousands of years ago. But it didn't. For millions of years, two giant rivers kept the Aral Sea alive. Every year, they carried huge amounts of fresh water from distant mountain glaciers into the basin. That new water replaced almost everything the desert heat took away. And because of that balance, the sea survived ice ages, collapsing empires, and massive climate shifts for millions of years. Then suddenly, that balance was broken. Not by nature, but by one of the most aggressive engineering projects the Soviet Union had ever attempted, the Soviet Cotton Empire. In the 1940s and 1950s, the Soviet Union wanted to become one of the world's largest cotton producers. Cotton was treated almost like a strategic weapon. The Soviet government even called it white gold. Factories across the USSR needed large amounts of fabric, and Soviet leaders wanted complete control over their own textile supply rather than relying on foreign imports. But there was one problem. Most of Central Asia was a dry desert, and under Joseph Stalin's massive industrial plans, that desert was about to be transformed into one of the biggest cotton-producing regions on Earth. Soviet officials looked at the empty lands of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan and saw something different. They saw millions of hectares of future farmland. And to make that happen, they needed water. An unbelievable amount of water. Because cotton is one of the thirstiest crops in the world. Producing just 1 kilogram of cotton fabric can require nearly 10,000 liters of water. And the only major water sources in the region were the 2 rivers that kept the Aral Sea alive, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya. So Soviet engineers began redirecting them. Massive dams were built. The largest of them all was the Karakum Canal in Turkmenistan, stretching more than 1,300 kilometers, one of the longest irrigation canals on Earth. But there was a serious problem hiding inside this giant project. Most of these canals were built quickly and cheaply. Many were nothing more than huge dirt trenches cut into desert sand. Water leaked out constantly. In some places, more than half of the water disappeared into the ground or evaporated before it even reached a single cotton field. And yet the Soviet Union kept expanding the system anyway, because this was no longer just agriculture. It had become political. Moscow demanded higher cotton production every year. Scientists warned that the Aral Sea was shrinking dangerously fast, but many Soviet leaders simply did not care. And slowly, year after year, the rivers feeding the sea began dying. Not because they disappeared, but because humans stopped them from ever reaching the Aral Sea in the first place. The poisoned desert. As the water disappeared, something far more dangerous started building inside it. Before the disaster, the Aral Sea had a fairly normal salt level, similar to ocean water. But as nearly 90% of the sea vanished, the remaining water became thicker. Salinity shot up to more than 100 grams per liter, nearly 3 times saltier than the Atlantic Ocean. In some areas, it even came close to the harsh conditions of the Dead Sea. And at that point, life inside the water simply could not survive, began dying out. Sturgeon disappeared. Carp disappeared. Even the famous Aral trout vanished completely. The fishing industry that once supported entire cities collapsed within just a few years. More than 60,000 jobs disappeared. Frozen fish from the Atlantic Ocean were secretly brought in by train just so local canning factories could continue operating for a little longer. But eventually, even that became impossible. Huge fishing ships that once floated on deep water became stranded in the desert. Over time, many of these rusting vessels were taken apart for scrap metal, leaving only their steel frames slowly sinking into the sand. But the real horror was only beginning. For decades, Soviet cotton farms had dumped huge amounts of pesticides and toxic chemicals into the rivers flowing toward the Aral Sea. When the water disappeared, all those chemicals remained trapped in the exposed seabed. The dry sea floor became a new desert, now called the Aralkum Desert. Powerful winds began lifting millions of tons of toxic salt and chemical dust into the air. These salt storms spread across Central Asia, poisoning farmland, contaminating drinking water, and destroying public health. Locally, the health impact was severe. The Aral Sea had once acted like a giant temperature regulator. Without it, summers became hotter and drier, while winters turned longer and brutally cold. In 1989, the disaster reached another breaking point. The Aral Sea was physically split into two separate bodies of water. The North and South would face two completely different futures. And to understand whether this sea could ever come back, we first need to look at the side that somehow survived. The North Aral. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The Aral Sea was no longer inside one country. It was now split between newly independent nations, and the northern part ended up completely inside Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan suddenly had a real, physical chance to save at least a piece of the sea. So a decision was made that would quietly define the future of the entire region. Let the South go, and focus everything on the North. In the 1990s, communities near the northern basin built small sand dikes by hand, simple barriers made with tractors. The goal was to block the water long enough for it to stay. It looked like the North might suffer the same fate as the rest of the sea. Kazakhstan partnered with the World Bank to build something far more powerful: the Aral Dam. The project was backed by a funding package of around $86 million. Finished in 2005, it wasn't a small barrier. It was a massive concrete dam, about 8 miles long, built across the narrow channel that once connected the northern and southern parts of the Aral Sea. And the result was far beyond expectations. Engineers thought recovery would take a decade. Instead, the water rose more than 12 meters in just 7 months. That kind of change is almost unheard of in a natural system. Even the geography began to shift. The shoreline slowly moved outward, reversing years of retreat. The port city of Aralsk, which had once been stranded nearly 100 kilometers away from the water, began to see the edge of the sea return, something it had not seen in decades. Today, the water is only around 15 to 20 kilometers away, and further expansion projects are still pushing it closer. But the real transformation was happening inside the water. As fresh river flow entered the basin, salinity dropped sharply, falling back to levels where life could survive again. And slowly, fish began to return. Some came back naturally through river connections. Others were reintroduced deliberately. More than 20 native fish species eventually reappeared in the basin. And once fish returned, the economy followed. Fishing came back to life, producing thousands of tons of catch every year. Processing plants reopened, modern facilities were built, and for the first time in decades, the region was exporting fish again to international markets. But this recovery came with a hidden consequence. Because by trapping so much water in the north, Kazakhstan had effectively cut off the flow to the south almost completely. And while one half of the Aral Sea was starting to heal, the other half was slipping into something far worse than before: the South Aral. From the very beginning, the South Aral Sea was in a very different condition. Unlike the northern basin, it was not deep. It was wide, shallow, and stretched across a huge area. And when it broke into separate eastern and western parts, the surface area became even more exposed. And in this region, that matters. Because here, evaporation is not slow. It is constant and aggressive. The basin sits deep inside the Kizilkum Desert, where temperatures rise fast and rain is almost absent. Without a strong, steady flow of river water, any small amount of water that appears disappears almost immediately. So the problem was never just that the South Aral lost water, it was that it could no longer hold it, and fixing it would require something almost impossible. Engineers calculated that to fully refill the South Aral Sea, you would need to stop all irrigation across Central Asia for several years. Every canal, every cotton field, every agricultural system depending on those rivers would have to be shut down completely. But that was never realistic. because Uzbekistan had already built its entire economy around that water. It is one of the world's largest cotton producers. If the water were redirected back into the sea, the result would not be recovery. It would be economic collapse on a national scale. So the choice became brutally simple: save a dead sea or save a living country. And that is when the strategy changed completely. Instead of trying to bring the water back, Uzbekistan began trying to survive what was left behind. Every wind carried salt, chemicals, and pesticide residue across nearby cities and farmland. The government launched a large-scale planting program across the dry sea floor. Saxol is not a normal tree. It's a desert shrub that can survive in extreme salt with almost no water. Slowly, parts of the empty seabed began turning into a controlled green zone, not a forest in the normal sense, but a shield against the wind. By now, more than 1.5 million hectares of the former sea floor have been covered in this effort. It is damage control. Soviet engineers once proposed reversing the flow of Siberia's rivers through a 2,500-kilometer canal towards Central Asia to refill the Aral Sea. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the idea was abandoned completely. By this point, we have seen the full story of both parts of the Aral Sea. But the real question is still there. Can the Aral Sea ever be brought back? The success of the North Aral naturally creates hope, even the idea that the old sea might return one day. But in reality, the answer is far more complicated. Can we bring back a lost sea? Over the last 50 years, when it was the fourth largest inland lake on Earth, then, by the 1990s, when much of it had collapsed into a growing desert, and now, a third stage. There are very few places on Earth that have gone through a transformation this extreme in such a short period of time. And naturally, when people see the success of the North Aral Sea, it creates a sense of possibility. Water returned faster than engineers predicted. Fish came back. For the first time in decades, people saw proof that at least some of the damage could be reversed. The reality is far more complicated. Because restoring the original Aral Sea, it is an economic challenge. The rivers feeding the Aral Sea cross multiple countries. China, for example, has already increased its use of water from the Irtysh River system. Central Asian countries continue competing over how shared river water should be distributed. And the old Soviet-era idea of diverting Siberian rivers would require cooperation from Russia, a country that has little incentive to redirect its own water resources. As populations grow and water demand rises, these competing interests are likely to become even more intense. Another obstacle would still remain: the water itself. Fresh water is becoming one of the world's most valuable resources. Growing populations and the rapid rise of AI data centers are all pushing water demand higher. The rivers that once sustained the Aral Sea face more competition today. But if this story sounds painful, here is the uncomfortable truth. It is not just the Aral Sea. If we zoom out and look around the world, in the United States, the Great Salt Lake has lost a huge portion of its surface area. Exposed lake bed is already creating toxic dust concerns for nearby communities. The Dead Sea is shrinking by more than a meter every year, and in Africa, Lake Chad has lost most of its historical size and climate pressures. Different countries, but the pattern is the same. Fresh water is disappearing at an alarming rate around the world. So in the end, the Aral Sea stands as one of the clearest examples in modern history of humans reshaping geography and then trying to reverse it. One half became a warning of how quickly a natural system can collapse, became a lesson that recovery is possible, but only up to a point. So what do you think about the future of this once great sea? And keeping the entire situation in mind, would you choose Kazakhstan's path of recovery or Uzbekistan's path of adaptation? Let us know what you think about this in the comments below. If you liked this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you don't want to miss more incredible videos like this, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you in the next one.